All right, State v. Shea. And again, this decision was handed down just this last Friday, January 19th, 2024. State of New Hampshire versus Joshua D. Shea. The list of counsel there for the state and for the defense. Let's see. And of course, the judges involved. Okay. So following a jury trial in Superior Court by Judge Shulman, the trial judge, the defendant Joshua D. Shea was convicted of criminal threatening with a deadly weapon. On appeal, the defendant argues that the trial court erred when instructing the jury regarding the statutory defense related to the display of a firearm. And then they have the citation here. These are all hyperlinked, by the way. If you're a member and you access this, this case, this is on the Law of Self-Defense database. So you can just click through and read the statutes as well. And we'll look at a couple of those. The jury heard the following evidence. On May 30th, 2022, the complainant was driving a truck on Route 28 in Epsom. He testified that a car driven by the defendant pulled out in front of him, causing him to slam on the brakes and hit his horn. The complainant and the defendant thereafter exchanged middle fingers. The complainant pulled into a gas station at the Epsom traffic circle. The defendant drove around the circle and pulled in behind the complainant. That's not good, folks. Don't be doing that. What's he doing, the defendant here? He's going to the fight, right? Rather than the fight coming to him. And that looks like a loss of innocence. Innocence being a required element of self-defense and therefore a target of attack for the prosecution. The testimony of the complainant and the defendant differed as to what happened thereafter. For purposes of deciding this appeal, the defendant's version of the events in question is relevant. The defendant testified that the complainant walked towards him aggressively, swearing and saying that he was going to rip the defendant out of his car. He further testified that the complainant said he would beat the defendant's ass and asked the defendant to pull into the parking lot next door where there were no cameras. So would pulling someone out of their car and beating someone's ass, would that qualify as merely a non-deadly force threat or a deadly force threat? I think you can credibly characterize that as a deadly force threat. In many states, there's a legal presumption that if you're invading someone's car, an occupied vehicle, forcing entry, you're doing it for the purpose of causing them deadly force harm. That's just legally presumed under the law in many jurisdictions. I didn't check for New Hampshire. I'm sorry. Beat someone's ass, that suggests more than a shove, right? That suggests a sustained beating that could cause death or serious bodily injury, which is the definition of a deadly force attack. One, reasonably likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. And an ass beating sounds a lot like serious bodily injury to me. Now, of course, jurors could differ on that. I think it's a zone of ambiguity, but the argument can be made with a straight face. So if you believe that, then you believe this defendant was facing a deadly force threat. If you don't believe that, maybe he was only facing a non-deadly force threat. If he was only facing a non-deadly force threat, then his only appropriate defensive response would be the use of non-deadly force. If he's facing a deadly force threat and the other conditions of self-defense are also met, then he might be privileged to use deadly force in self-defense. That's the element of proportionality, right? Non-deadly threat to non-deadly response. Deadly force threat to deadly force response. Continuing now, as the complainant approached him, the defendant was in fear of a confrontation. He warned the complainant that he had a firearm by unclipping the holster containing the firearm from his belt and rolling it up to his chest while informing the complainant that he had it. The complainant testified that the defendant pointed the gun at him. The defendant denied doing so. So we have now a defensive display of a gun. Is a defensive display of a gun deadly force? Well, the gun is deadly force, but is the mere display deadly force if it's done in lawful self-defense? This is another area of the law that's often ambiguous because, of course, a prosecutor is free to argue that it was not lawful self-defense, that you just wanted to scare somebody with your gun, not with the justification of self-defense, in which case you're just committing aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, which in most jurisdictions is good for 10 to 20 years in prison. So, on the other hand, display arguably is not the same thing as discharge, right? A discharge of the gun is clearly a use of the gun. Is mere display the same thing? Now, In the adjacent state of Massachusetts here, they do treat it the same. So in order to be justified in merely displaying a gun, making someone else aware that you have a gun for purpose of changing their behavior, and not having that be a crime, all the conditions also have to exist that would be necessary for you to actually shoot that person. The 5 elements of self-defense. And this is basically a public policy decision by Massachusetts from their highest court, saying that we're going to require the same conditions for display as we do for shooting because we want to discourage display unless it's really, really needed, unless the conditions for use of the gun have already been met. Most other states don't make it that black and white. In fact, a lot of states have adopted defensive display statutes. New Hampshire is one of those. We're going to see it. That essentially says, hey, if you're displaying the gun for purposes of self-defense, that's not a crime. I'm always kind of ambivalent about those statutes because, well, of course, if you're displaying it for self-defense, it's not a crime. But the whole point that you're facing legal jeopardy is somebody, the state, doesn't believe it was self-defense. So if they don't believe it was self-defense, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt on that statute either. This case actually brings another angle to the argument that I find more compelling. We'll get to that in just a moment. The defendant was indicted for criminal threatening, basically aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, in relevant part for placing or attempting to place the complainant in fear of imminent bodily injury by pointing a firearm at him. Right? That's aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The relevant statute provides the following defense to a charge of criminal threatening. And this is essentially the defensive display statute for New Hampshire. Quote, a person who responds to a threat which would be considered by a reasonable person as likely to cause serious bodily injury or death. So you're responding to a deadly force threat to the person or to another. Someone who responds by displaying a firearm or other means of self-defense with the intent to warn away the person making the threat shall not have committed a criminal act under this section. Close quote. So, if you believe here the other party was presenting a deadly force threat, I'm going to rip you out of the car and beat your ass. This statute says, well, then you'd be privileged in displaying a gun to warn them away. And that would not be a crime under this criminal threatening statute. So you have to assume for this safe harbor to apply that the other party was presenting a deadly force threat, one readily capable of causing death or serious bodily injury. There's also another statute that's a variation of this defensive display language. I think it's found in the actual, yes, it's found in New Hampshire's 627.4 is New Hampshire's kind of core self-defense statute. See also RSA, revised statutes annotated for New Hampshire, 627.4 stating that a person who responds to a threat which would be considered by a reasonable person as likely to cause serious bodily injury or death to the person or another, so a deadly force threat, by displaying a firearm or other means of self-defense with the intent to warn away the person making the threat shall not have committed a criminal act. Period. So the previous paragraph we read applied only to the specific crime of criminal threatening. This defensive display language in the self-defense statute itself simply makes it not a crime at all if you meet these conditions. Let's see. So this is interesting. So what this court is saying here, parenthetically, interpreting this defensive display language in the self-defense statute, is that it's saying that the act of producing or displaying a weapon shall constitute non-deadly force if it's done in lawful self-defense. So I just mentioned that in Massachusetts, before you could shoot someone with a gun, you'd have to meet all the conditions for the use of deadly force in self-defense. And in Massachusetts, before you can display a gun, you have to meet all the conditions that would privilege you to use deadly force in self-defense. And one of those would be that you're facing a deadly force threat. And implicit in that is that your mere display of the gun under Massachusetts law is deadly force. This New Hampshire Supreme Court decision is saying, well, the producing or displaying of a weapon in self-defense purposes is not only, they're not saying merely that it's ambiguous, it could be deadly force or not deadly force, and we'll let the jury decide. They're saying, as a matter of law, the display of that gun for self-defense purposes is only non-deadly force. Well, that's convenient. Regarding this defense, the trial court instructed the jury that the display of the firearm must be made in response to a threat, and that the threat must be of such a nature that a reasonable person acting under the same circumstances as the defendant would have believed that the person or persons making the threat were likely to cause death or serious bodily injury to the defendant or a third person. So far, so good. That's consistent with the law that we've already seen. Here's where the trial court gets in trouble. Here's where he goes soft, stand your ground. The court further explained, quote, in determining whether a reasonable person acting under the same circumstances would have believed that a threat of likely death or serious bodily injury was present, you must consider all the circumstances known to the defendant. Here's where it goes sideways. This is the soft, stand your ground language. You should consider these circumstances as they were presented to the defendant at the time and not necessarily as they appear upon detached reflection. And now explicitly the soft, stand your ground language in italics. One factor that you may consider, you don't have to, there's no legal duty, but you may consider it, jury, in determining whether the threat existed is whether the defendant could have completely and safely left the area without any risk to himself or others. Close quote. Now back to the opinion here. The defendant contends that the emphasized instruction erroneously imposed upon the defendant a duty to retreat not imposed by statute. Resolving this issue by the New Hampshire Supreme Court requires us to construe the relevant statute. And the relevant statute, 631(4), is the criminal threatening statute. And I have to say, well, maybe, but you could also just look to the self-defense statute, which has the same defensive display language. The interpretation of a statute is a question of law, which we review de novo. That means they're looking at this question like it was never addressed by the trial court or anybody else before. We construe the criminal code according to the fair import of its terms and to promote justice. Our goal is to apply the statutes in light of the legislature's intent in enacting them and in light of the policies sought to be advanced by the entire statutory scheme. When interpreting a statute, we look first to the language of the statute itself, and if possible, construe the language according to its plain and ordinary meaning. We do not read words or phrases in isolation, but in the context of the entire statutory scheme. The defendant argues that determining whether a reasonable person would consider a threat as likely to cause serious bodily injury or death, such that the threatened person may display a firearm to warn away the person making the threat, does not include consideration of the threatened person's ability to retreat. We agree. The relevant criminal threatening statute addresses an action that a person may take in response to a threat that a reasonable person would consider as likely to cause serious bodily injury or death. That is, in essence, a threat of deadly force. Then they have C statute 627(9). That's a definitions statute, so it defines a whole bunch of stuff. The statute also defines deadly force as any assault or confinement committed with the purpose of causing death or serious bodily injury. The criminal threatening statute recognizes that the threatened person may respond by displaying a firearm to warn away the person making the threat. That is, it describes the use of a type of non-deadly force as a response. So this is really touching upon questions of proportionality, right? What intensity of threat do you have to be faced with? A deadly force threat. And is your display of a gun merely non-deadly force in response? And explicitly by statute, that is, if you meet the conditions of the statute. Basically, that you're doing it in otherwise lawful self-defense. Now, I would suggest the train's coming through. I'm told in the comments that you guys can't hear the train, but it is coming through so clearly in my earbuds, which means it's going into the microphone. I can't believe you can't hear it. All right, I think it's gone. Second time this show already that's happened. Crazy. So I would suggest that what they're talking about here in this paragraph is defensive display. Does defensive display, is it disproportional to the threat? Have you escalated to a deadly force response when you're only facing a non-deadly force threat? Those would be questions of proportionality, questions of the element of innocence. Have you become an unlawful aggressor? And then the court suddenly transitions into the element of avoidance as if it were a continuum from this defensive display question. And it's really not. It's a completely distinct legal doctrine and legal argument, whether or not there was a safe possibility of retreat. Whether or not the defensive display was lawful is one question. Whether or not this defendant had a legal duty to retreat is a separate question. So now we're moving on to, I would have put like a subhead here to make clear that we're transitioning from one set of legal arguments to another, from one set of elements of self-defense to a different element of self-defense. But I don't think the court has the clarity to understand that they're actually talking about distinct elements of self-defense, because I don't think they've read my book. So they're kind of conflating these things. So what do they have to say about retreat? The legislature has also specifically addressed the response of retreating from an encounter. Prior to 2011, the self-defense statute codified the duty to retreat doctrine. So prior to 2011, New Hampshire was a duty to retreat state. You had a legal duty to retreat if safely possible, if you were defending yourself, unless you were in your home and fell within the scope of the Castle Doctrine. The Castle Doctrine relieves you of an otherwise existing legal duty to retreat if you're defending yourself in your home. That's what the Castle Doctrine does. Prior to 2011, the self-defense statute codified the duty to retreat doctrine, providing that a person is not justified in using deadly force to defend himself from the use of deadly force by another when the person could, with complete safety, retreat from the encounter, unless he is in his dwelling or its curtilage and is not the initial aggressor. So that's the Castle Doctrine, safe harbor there from the legal duty to retreat that's otherwise generalized. In 2011, the statute was amended to provide that the duty to retreat before using deadly force does not apply when the person is anywhere he has a right to be and was not the initial aggressor. Well, they keep adding that. If you were the initial aggressor, it was not otherwise lawful self-defense. If you were the initial aggressor, you lose the element of innocence. And if you lose the element of innocence, you have no self-defense claim. We don't even need to consider the possibility of retreat. You've already lost self-defense. Significantly, however, while the legislature has chosen to recognize said duties to retreat before the defensive use of deadly force, no such duty has been identified by the legislature upon the defensive use of non-deadly force. And this is almost always true everywhere, folks, even in the currently existing duty to retreat states, the 11 states that do impose a generalized legal duty to retreat if safely possible before you can use deadly force in self-defense. There's only one that imposes that legal duty to retreat before you're using non-deadly force in self-defense, like shoving someone or using pepper spray. And that is, again, Massachusetts. Massachusetts imposes its legal duty to retreat before you can use any defensive force, either non-deadly or deadly. But the norm, and the historical norm, has been that the duty to retreat only applied before you used deadly force in self-defense. You did not have that legal duty to retreat if you were limiting yourself to non-deadly force in self-defense. So that's the norm. And that was the case in New Hampshire as well. And then in 2011, what they effectively did was they removed that legal duty from before deadly force self-defense as well. 2 points become clear upon reflection. First, when the legislature intends that a person be required to retreat as the person's first response, it knows how to make that requirement clear. We know that because they used to, right? Thus, if the legislature had intended that a person be required to respond to a threat likely to cause serious bodily injury or death by retreating before being justified in responding with the non-deadly force of displaying a firearm to warn away the threatening person, it would have said so. All right, folks, so this is where I start getting frustrated because, again, now they're conflating two different things. They're conflating the elements of avoidance and the elements of proportionality. If you're facing a threat likely to cause serious bodily injury or death, you're privileged to respond with deadly force, deadly defensive force in an otherwise lawful case of self-defense. So you don't have to worry about the element of proportionality there. The deadly force nature of the threat against you already gives you the privilege to use the maximum level of defensive force. And I'm hesitating a little bit because I can envision circumstances in which this distinction could matter. And that might be in a defensive display scenario where the intensity of the threat is deadly force in nature, but it's not yet an imminent threat. So it's somebody armed with a baseball bat, and it's this road rage scenario. They're screaming at you. They're going to beat your ass with that bat. All this stuff. They're going to drag you out of the car, but they're 50 yards away from you. So they are the initial unlawful aggressor, the element of innocence. They are presenting as a deadly force threat, the element of proportionality. You're perceiving it reasonably. You're not imagining that you're being threatened. But because they're 50 yards away, the element of imminence has not yet been satisfied. So imminence requires that the threat you're defending yourself against has to either be actually occurring, you're getting beat with the bat, or it's immediately about to occur. Well, it's not immediately about to occur or actually happening if the guy with the bat's 50 yards away. He's got ability. How do we evaluate imminence? Ability, opportunity, jeopardy. He has ability. He's got the bat. And he's got jeopardy. He's conducting himself in such a way that a reasonable person would perceive he intends to harm you with the bat. But he doesn't yet have opportunity. He's too far away for a contact weapon in his hands to be brought against you. Now, if he keeps closing proximity, eventually he'll be close enough that he does qualify as an imminent threat, at which point you'd be privileged to shoot him. But in the real world, you don't just want to do nothing until suddenly you're compelled and privileged under law to whip your gun out of the holster and shoot the guy dead. You'd prefer not to have to shoot anybody. And that's when you might make a defensive display sometime before imminence has been realized to deter him from carrying through his attack so you don't have to shoot him. So in that case, it might be helpful for the law to say, if you're making a defensive display pre-imminence, now if imminence is satisfied, you can just shoot. But if you're making a defensive display under circumstances where shooting would not yet be legally appropriate because he's still too far away to qualify as an imminent threat, it could be helpful there to characterize your display as non-deadly force as a matter of law. But having said that, the court's not saying any of that. They're not making clear how this would apply in a generalized way, which makes it very difficult in the future for lawyers to really understand what the fundamental principles are here that might apply to a different fact pattern than what's described in this particular case. It's what I don't like about this opinion. It's kind of, that's why I call it muddy. It obscures key issues rather than bringing clarity to them. Let's see. Second, the court opinion continues, requiring a person to respond to a threat likely to cause serious bodily injury or death by retreating before being justified in responding with the non-deadly force of displaying a firearm would be inconsistent with the 2011 adoption of stand your ground. After 2011, a person is justified in using deadly force when he reasonably believes that another person is about to use unlawful deadly force against him. And he's not required to retreat if he's anywhere he has a right to be and is not the initial aggressor. Here, we are considering the response to a threat, which would be considered by a reasonable person as likely to cause serious bodily injury or death. That is essentially a threat of deadly force. Accordingly, we conclude that when determining whether a threat would be considered by a reasonable person as likely to cause serious bodily injury or death, the threatened person's ability to respond by retreating in lieu of displaying a firearm is not a relevant factor. Well, when this court says it's not a relevant factor, they mean it's not a relevant factor for a jury's consideration. And if it's not, if retreat is not a relevant factor for a jury's consideration, when a defender is facing a deadly force threat in otherwise lawful self-defense, if it's not a factor relevant to a jury's consideration, then a prosecutor is not allowed to argue that issue in that way because it's not relevant to the jury's consideration. And a judge ought not give a jury instruction on it. The jury should only be instructed on things that are relevant to the jury's considerations. The decision continues. We agree with the defendant that the trial court erred by instructing the jury that one factor it could consider in determining whether the threat existed was whether the defendant could have completely and safely left the area without any risk to himself or others. We note that if the legislature disagrees with our interpretation of the statute, it is free within constitutional limits to amend the statute as it sees fit. In conclusion, we reverse the defendant's conviction and remand. Remand means it's sent back to trial for another prosecution if the prosecutors want to. In light of our ruling on this issue, we need not address the defendant's other arguments. So I guess the defendant had other claims on appeal, but this one by itself reverses the conviction. They don't need to address those others. And usually that means they don't foresee them coming up again in the new trial. If they did foresee the other arguments arising again in the new trial, then they might address them, even though they don't need to for this reversal, but just to bring clarity to the trial judge on what they expect him to do the second time around. So we don't have another appeal. Let's see. So my concern here is that although they reverse this guy's conviction, and they're saying, it seems to me that they're saying, hey, New Hampshire, guess what? Of course, they're not using this language because, again, they haven't read my book. But there's, in one sense, it seems like they're saying, hey, what the judge did was give the jury a soft stand your ground instruction, right? That italicized part of the jury instruction here. One factor that you may consider in determining whether the threat existed is whether the defendant could have completely and safely left the area without any risk to himself or others. That's not a duty to retreat instruction. That's not telling the jury this defendant had a legal duty to retreat before he could defend himself. But it's not a hard stand your ground instruction. It's not telling the jury they're prohibited from considering the possibility of retreat. It's saying, hey, there's no legal duty, but you're allowed to consider retreat. And if effectively, if a reasonable person would have left, would have retreated, and this defendant didn't do that, well, then his self-defense was unreasonable. And if you lose the element of reasonableness, you lose self-defense. So a cleaner written decision would simply have made that statement of law, that the jury is not allowed to consider the possibility of retreat. That's how Texas would do it. But what they do here is they conflate this with a lot of proportionality stuff, like whether the defensive display is deadly or non-deadly force. So now if I were practicing law in New Hampshire and I had a client who hadn't retreated, I would cite this case as an argument in support of a hard stand your ground position. But the prosecution might say, well, that's what that decision says. The Shea decision says on the facts of Shea, but that involved just a defensive display. It didn't involve an actual gunshot. In fact, the Shea court said explicitly that defendant, Shea, his display of the gun was non-deadly force as a matter of law. So hard stand your ground might be the law in New Hampshire if the defendant only used non-deadly force, but not if he used deadly force. And if my client had actually used deadly force and shot that other dude, now there's an angle of attack on my claim of hard stand your ground. Now maybe my jury does get this soft stand your ground instruction. It would have been nice if the justices here had made clear that the hard stand your ground position is the appropriate one, regardless of the nature of deadly force use. By the way, particularly since the court here is saying that the aggressor, the complainant, was presenting as a deadly force threat. So if the complainant was presenting as a deadly force threat, why wouldn't this defendant have been privileged to actually shoot him, use deadly force in self-defense? Again, maybe there was an absence of imminence, but the court's not not making that argument here. So, I read this decision and I'm asking myself, well, do I need to add New Hampshire to my little list of hard stand your ground states? And I don't know what the answer to that is. Is it only hard stand your ground state if the defender only used non-deadly force in self-defense? So it's a much muddier decision than I would have liked. And maybe I should send these justices I'll send them just free copies of my book. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. How many people are on the New Hampshire Supreme Court? Oh, come on. Why don't you just list the justices? It's only 5, a chief justice and 4 associates. So they had a 4 of them are concurring on this opinion. 1, 2, 3, 4, including the chief justice. They don't mention the 5th person, so I don't know if they even played a role. They didn't write a dissent, that's for sure.